Welcome to our Lunchbreak Bible study and discussion. My name is James Lindberg, pastor of Living Grace Lutheran Church, coming to you from Omaha, Nebraska. And we are working our way through the book of Philippians this summer. And what I'm doing here is I'm reading through Philippians and making some comments. And I would invite you, if you're watching, to also make some comments as well. And we're going to have this not just as a Bible study, me dispensing information, but also this is going to be a discussion that we can have as well. So thank you for your participation. There is a delay when it comes to when you type and hit enter and when there's a delay of about 20 seconds. So it might take some time for me to respond to anything that you put in the comments section. As I said, we are looking at the book of Philippians in the New Testament. And I want to give you a map so that way you can see where we are talking about in this area of the world, this ancient Roman world. And we're looking at obviously modern day Italy. Rome is where the Apostle Paul is writing from. And he is writing to the Christians who live in the city of Philippi, which would be in modern day Greece. So that's where Paul is writing from, Rome, and that's where he is writing to the people who are living in the city of Philippi. And a few key points about this book. It's written 61 to 63 AD, so about approximately 30 years after Jesus had died. And it's perhaps about a dozen years after Paul has started the church in the city of Philippi. So he started the church about 12 years ago and then left to go start other churches. And it's been 12 years between when he started the church and when he's writing to them. Where's he writing from? Well, we said that Paul was in Rome, and he's actually in prison in Rome, or imprisoned. When we think of being in prison, he might have been in a traditional jail cell like we might think of. He also might have been on house arrest too. So for some, we don't know exactly. But he is imprisoned in some way. His freedoms have been restricted, and that is why he's in Rome. The Philippian Christians are supporting Paul financially. When you were imprisoned in the ancient world, it's not like the government, gave you what you needed. He had to have people support him, get him food, get him what he needed. And that the Philippian Christians are doing that. They're supporting him financially while he is in prison. And so he is thankful for them, and he's joyful. And that's why thankfulness and joy are the main themes in this letter. And we're going to see those themes of joy and thankfulness come up again as we take a look at the next part of Philippians chapter 2. So last week, when we were looking at Philippians chapter 2, the first part of it, Paul wants the Philippian Christians to be unified. That's his instructions to them in this part of the letter. He wants them to be unified. And rather than just saying, Philippians, I want you to be unified, he gives them practical ways of promoting unity in their community. He gives them instructions about how they can be unified. Of course, we know that unity is important. Unity is important, whether we're at work or within a family situation or with our friends, being united in a work team. You want everybody on the team to be working together, to be united. If you're in a volunteer board or a volunteer committee, you want people to be unified and working together. Well, that's what Paul wants for the Philippians, and he gives some examples about how they can be unified. And in fact, he uses an example of Christ and Christ's humility, because he talks about being humble. That's one way to be unified, is to be humble, to not think of yourself as better than other people, to look to other people's interests, not just to your own. So talking about being humble. And he uses an example of Christ's humility as an example for them to follow. And he has something called the hymn to Christ, a song or a hymn, a religious song that they would sing, and he quotes that. Of course, we don't have the tunes to that song, but scholars believe that this was an ancient hymn that they would sing, and so Paul reminds them of the words of that ancient song about Christ and Christ's humility. And as we look in this next section here, Paul continues with more advice about how we are to be unified, what that unity looks like, and gives again some more practical examples. So again, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 2, and we're going to begin at verse 14. I'll have the words on the screen. You could also follow along at BibleGateway.com. We're using the New Living Translation for our Bible study. So let's jump on into it after that background and see what Paul talks about when it comes to unity. It says, do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. Yeah, complaining and arguing are definitely not things that bring people together. In fact, maybe you've been in a situation, or with a relationship where people are continuing to complain or argue, and boy, that leads to disunity. Or maybe you've been in the room before when two people are arguing, and maybe you find that position uncomfortable. I know I do. If two people are arguing and they're getting into a heated argument, I kind of start to feel like, uncomfortable with what's going on. Maybe that's because I'm not a huge fan of conflict. But Paul says, do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. I mean, Paul is really interested as to how the outside world views them, how non-Christians view the Philippian believers, how non-Christians view Christians. And he says, don't complain, don't argue. It's not a good witness to your faith. We don't want people to criticize you for being, that group of people that are always complaining, that group of people that are always arguing, that group of people that are always at each other's throats. Paul says, don't do that. We don't want to be criticized by other people. So he says, do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. And boy, what great advice for you and I. And I know it's obviously not possible to do everything without complaining and arguing. I mean, yeah, sometimes it just feels good to complain about stuff. Sometimes we feel, we wake up in the morning and we're kind of aggressive that day and we argue. Or maybe we argue with someone because we're passionate about something. So complaining and arguing is not something that we're totally going to be able to get rid of in life. But we should watch that. And Paul is telling the Philippian Christians to do that, to do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. Now, this is not anything new when it came to the Israelite people, going back to the wilderness when they were leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. They did a lot of complaining and they did a lot of arguing with Moses and with each other and with God. So maybe Paul is hearkening back to this, to do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. And then he talks to them about what kind of lives they are to live. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. I think Paul's view of the world, when he looks out into the world, at least according to this passage, he doesn't see, goodness and wonder and, people who are good at heart. No, he looks out in the world and he doesn't like what he sees. He sees a world full of crooked people and perverse people. And I think sometimes we can maybe agree with that. When we see things that happen in the news or tragedies that happen or people taking advantage of other people, when things happen to people that are wrong and other people have stolen from them perhaps, we can look and we can say, man, it just seems like there's a bunch of crooked and perverse people out there in the world. So maybe that's a view that we have. Of course, I don't think it's true all the time. But for Paul, he really has this really negative view of the world. But he says instead, live clean lives, innocent lives, as children of God, shining like bright lights. Boy, what if the life that you and I had were like, what if the lives that we had were like shining bright lights into the world, shining bright lights of peace and truth and hope and encouragement. I imagine there would be more people who probably want to be a part of our churches if that's the type of lives that we lived, rather than lives that are full of judgment and hatred and we hate these people and don't like these people and don't believe in rights for those people. Boy, imagine if our lives were differently, if we reflected this idea of shining like a bright light in the world. Boy, that would be very attractive, and Paul knows that, and he's telling the Philippian Christians again to shine like bright lights. And he again has this negative view of the world, that the world has very crooked people and perverse people in it. Verse 16, he says, hold firmly to the word of life. Then on the day of Christ's return, I'll be proud that I did not run the race in vain and that my work was not useless. But Paul is talking about the day of Christ's return here. And he's mentioning that when he's talking to the Philippian believers. Paul, when you look at other passages and some of other Paul's letters, Paul had this view of Christ returning. It was called an imminent view. He believed that Christ was coming very soon, and he communicated that to other people. And that, in fact, caused kind of some problems when people were Christians and they were believing Christ is going to come back soon, and then they saw their relatives passing away or their Christians passing away, and Christ hadn't come back yet. So Paul and the others believed that, Christ's return, Christ was going to come back very soon. And Paul is appealing to that, when he says here, hold firmly to the word of life, then on that day of Christ's return, I'll be proud that I did not run the race in vain and that my work was not useless. Of course, now we look at it, 2,000 years later, and we realize that, Christ has not returned in the body. Christ has not returned as Paul thought or as other people in the New Testament times thought. That's okay. We still watch and wait for Christ's return, but we see this within Paul's letter here to the Philippians of him looking forward to that day of Christ's return. Paul says, but I will rejoice even if I lose my life, even if he's on trial right now in Rome, and even if he's found guilty and he's executed for being, for being in a certain sense a subversive, for his subversive activities against the state. That's what he's been charged with, about creating problems, undermining Roman authority, creating subservient, doing things that were causing the overthrow of the state. Being a revolutionary is another way. It says, I will rejoice even if I lose my life, pouring it out like a liquid offering to God, just like your faithful service is an offering to God. So what's he talking about here? This idea of pouring it out like a liquid offering, just like pouring it out like his life, like a liquid offering to God. And maybe we've heard that statement, pouring one out for the homies. I don't want to pour anything out of here because I have my computer down here and I don't want to put get liquid on my computer. But you see, pouring one out for the homies. Pouring out a little part of the drink to remember those who have passed away. And they used to do that in the ancient world as well. It was a very familiar image. In fact, they would, at the beginning of banquets, they would pour out a little bit of liquid as in memory of those who had passed away. They would pour out water or wine, which was the most common thing that they would do that. So there is this familiar image of Paul says, I'm going to rejoice. Even if I lose my life, he's going to pour it out like a liquid offering. His life is going to be an offering, just like it would be an offering to pour one out for the homies. But he says that, but I will rejoice. And again, that idea of joy comes through again in this letter. Joy is a common theme throughout this letter. He says, I will rejoice, even if I lose my life, pouring it out like a liquid offering to God, just like your faithful service is an offering to God. So they're giving offerings to God. Paul's life, he says, will be an offering if he dies. Their service, their actions on behalf of Christ, their faith, that's like an offering to God. And he says, I will rejoice. Again, that theme of rejoice really coming through again in this passage. Let's take a look again. So we're going to finish up verse 17 here. And he says, and I want all of you to share that joy. He's got this joy and he wants to share that joy with them. And he wants them to be joyful. He says, not only am I rejoicing, joyful, he says to the Philippians, yes, you Philippians, you should rejoice, and I will share your joy. Well, everybody is just full of joy. Paul talks about him being joyful himself, and he wants them to be joyful. He wants to share that joy with him, and then he will share joy. And they're just one big ball of joy, which we said is kind of strange when you think of Paul writing this letter from prison, from imprisonment. Maybe the Philippian Christians may be facing some persecution of their own, but Paul really wants to lift up this idea or this theme of joy. And again, we see that here in this passage. And I want all of you to share that joy, to share his joy. Yes, you should rejoice, and I will share your joy. That's what he wants. Imagine if if our churches and our work teams and our groups our families, or the groups that we work with, maybe for volunteer organizations. What if we were joyful? I mean, all the time. Boy, that would certainly have a positive impact on our work and on our relationships. So maybe that's why Paul is most interested in joy, and why joy is the theme here. Plus, he loves the Philippians. He cares for them. He has a high view of them. And maybe he's joyful just because he really likes them. Well, we're going to take a look at verse 10 now. And Paul is going to commend one of his companions, traveling companion, Timothy. Paul was very close to Timothy. In fact, maybe they had some sort of kind of like a father-son relationship, a mentor-mentee relationship. And Paul is going to talk about Timothy and how important Timothy is to him. And also, we'll see as we go into this part of the letter, Paul is going to start talking about his traveling plans. And sometimes they would do that in letters. As travelers went from place to place, they would carry letters, they would carry news with them. And that's really how people got their news, was by people traveling from place to place. They didn't have the Roman Times or something, or a newspaper, or obviously they didn't have the internet or instant news access. So word would have to travel from place to place by individuals. And that's one of the things that Timothy and other people are going to do, is they're going to carry news to Paul, and news from Paul back to the Philippians. So Paul is commending Timothy. If the Lord Jesus is willing, I hope to send Timothy to you soon for a visit. Then he can cheer me up by telling me how you are getting along. So Paul's sending news, to them through Timothy. Timothy coming back, sharing, news with Paul about how the Philippians are doing, and he really wants that. He needs to be cheered up. I mean, we talked about joy and him being joyful, but maybe we get an insight into a little bit of Paul's heart here, where he talks about this idea of being cheered up by Timothy's words, as Timothy goes to the Philippian Christians and shares information from Paul with them, and then Timothy finds out what's going on there, and then comes back to Paul. So he says, then Timothy can cheer me up by telling me how you're getting along. So maybe Paul is maybe not joyful all the time, but does need some cheering up because of his situation. I mean, think about, he's now imprisoned. His freedom, his mobility has been restricted, and that's very different for Paul. Paul was used to using his Roman citizenship, and he was used to traveling around the ancient world and going from place to place and working perhaps as a tent maker, but starting churches. And then after a while, once a church got started, then he would move to the next place and move to the next place. So he was, an itinerant preacher, a church planter. So maybe he is a little bit down when it comes to having to stay in one place and having his freedom restricted, for someone who, really enjoyed, and really felt he was on a mission to start churches and do that around the ancient Roman world. So he talks about sending along Timothy, and Timothy coming back to Paul and telling Paul how the Philippians are getting along. He says, I have no one else like Timothy who generally cares about your welfare. So Paul really, again, respects Timothy. All the others care only for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. Maybe Paul is referring to those people who were preaching. There are people who realized that Paul was in prison, and so they were preaching, but they were doing it out of, and we saw this earlier in Philippians, they were doing it, out of spite. They were doing it to hurt Paul. They were doing it, to get back at Paul because they didn't like Paul. And Paul said, what, these people are preaching against me. Doesn't matter. The word of Christ is getting out into the world, so I'm not going to worry about them. And so maybe he's referring to these folks again. Those other people who are preaching, they only care for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. And he also is saying, again, that Timothy is one of those folks who is, someone who cares about Christ and someone who cares about Paul. Someone who generally cares about the welfare of the Philippians. And maybe, versus some of those other preachers who want to go and preach and then maybe collect money and keep that money. So Paul, again, has a very, very high and respected view of Timothy. All the others care only for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. But you know how Timothy has proved himself like a son with his father. He has served with me in preaching the good news. Here we go, that relationship, Timothy and Paul. That relationship between like a father and a son. It's a very close relationship that they have. But you know how Timothy has proved himself like a son with his father. He has served with me in preaching the good news. And Timothy had traveled around with Paul, one of Paul's traveling companions. Paul had a couple of different ones over, during his ministry. Timothy, a very important traveling companion to Paul. I hope to send him to you just as soon as I find out what is going to happen to me here. So Paul wants to wait. Maybe he wants to wait and see, what the results of his trial is going to be, what maybe his sentence would be. Maybe if he's let free, then he can have some good news for Timothy to share with the Philippians. So Paul says, I want to send Timothy to you. I want to send information to you. I want to tell you what's going on, but I'm going to do it as soon as I find out what's going on with me. Once I know about my disposition and my status and my case before the emperor, then I'm going to wait. Also back then, travel was extremely dangerous, and he wants to wait for that time when he has some real news to share with the Philippians, rather than just maybe minor greetings or something. When he has some real news to share, because of how difficult travel is, he wants to wait to send Timothy. So I hope to send him to you, hope to send Timothy to you just as soon as I find out what's going to happen to me here. And I have confidence from the Lord that I myself will come to see you soon. Well, there you go. Paul has confidence. He has confidence that he's going to be freed. He has confidence that maybe he'll win his case when it comes to the emperor and his hearing before the emperor. Paul has confidence that this is not where it's going to end for him. So he's got enough confidence that he's going to also give some of his travel plans. And they would do that in letters in the ancient world. They would also, within the letters, not only share news, but also share about the travel plans that they have. And I really like what Paul is saying here. And I have confidence from the Lord that I myself will come to see you soon. Paul has confidence that that he will be able to see the Philippians, and that prison is not his final destination. He's got some other things that are going to be happening to him as well. Good things. Paul then mentions someone else, not only Timothy, but Epaphroditus. Meanwhile, Paul says, I thought I should send Epaphroditus. So Paul is sending someone, and maybe, Epaphroditus is the one that's carrying this letter that we're reading right now back to the Philippians. Maybe these are the words that Epaphroditus shared with the Philippians that Paul wrote. Maybe the words from Timothy, the letter from Timothy that Paul wrote, that news from Timothy never got sent. So Paul is going to send Epaphroditus. Now, who is Epaphroditus? He says, meanwhile, I thought I should send Epaphroditus back to you. He is a true brother, co-worker, and a fellow soldier. So again, Paul has a high view, a very respected view of Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus seems to be one of those people that's been a messenger back and forth between the Philippians and between Paul. Now think about, with the Philippians, if they were going to send Paul money, so that way they could help take care of his needs while he is in prison, they would have to send someone that's trustworthy. Because what if they gave someone a bunch of money and that person just stole the money and went along their way and never came back? So Paul says Epaphroditus is a true brother, a co-worker, a fellow soldier. He's trustworthy, and he is willing to, send Epaphroditus back, and know that Epaphroditus will make that journey back to the Philippians. So that's something, again, that Epaphroditus was doing, is bringing those gifts from the Philippians to Paul. And like Timothy, Paul has a very important and a very respected view of Epaphroditus. So what about Epaphroditus? What's more about him? Paul says, and he was your messenger to help me in my need. I am sending him because he has been longing to see you. Maybe Epaphroditus was from that area, and Epaphroditus wants to go back to his home, and see the Philippians again, but he wants to see the Philippians. And so Paul says, I'm sending him because he has been longing to see you. Maybe Timothy not so much. Maybe Timothy is okay with staying with Paul. And Epaphroditus was very distressed that you heard he was ill. And he certainly was ill. In fact, he almost died. But God had mercy on him and also on me, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. So here we get a little bit of kind of inside baseball. The Philippians hear that Epaphroditus was ill and they're worried about him. And Paul said, yeah, he was ill. I mean, think about 2,000 years ago, before the advent of modern medicine. I mean, if you got ill, things that we have vaccines for today, they could kill you back then. So they were very worried about Epaphroditus. They loved Epaphroditus. And they were worried about him when he was ill. And Paul says, yes, he was ill. But, in fact, he almost died. But he's a lot better now. And that's why I want to send him back to you. Because you Philippians love him and care for him. And you trust him. And he's been that great messenger between you and me and bringing me your gifts. So Paul, again, is very, very respectful of Epaphroditus. And this gets back to, letters that people would share. When people shared letters, they would also share news about, their health as well. And Epaphroditus maybe was along the way, on one of those journeys that Epaphroditus got sick. And think about, going from place to place, different parts of the world back then. They had typhoid fever, they had malaria, those were common. So it was pretty easy if you were out traveling, to get sick. Just like when we might travel to a different country, depending on the country, we have to get updated shots, because they have different illnesses there and different viruses and bacteria than we would in maybe the place where we live. So getting ill was something that was kind of par for the course when you were traveling, and almost took Epaphroditus' life. But Paul says, but God had mercy on him. Paul believes that it is God that has healed Epaphroditus, that God had mercy on Epaphroditus and made sure he didn't die. And Paul says God has also had mercy on me, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. So again, Paul realizing, that maybe he's not as joyful as we might think he is. That he doesn't, maybe he's feeling kind of bad about being in prison, and he's feeling sorrowful for that. But God had mercy on him, kept Epaphroditus alive, and also made sure that Paul didn't have another sorrow to experience, and that would have been Epaphroditus' death. So I'm all the more anxious to send him back to you, for I know you'll be glad to see him, and then I will not be so worried about you. Welcome him in the Lord's love and with great joy. There's the word of joy again. And give him the honor that people like him deserve. For he risked his life for the work of Christ, and he was at the point of death while doing for me what you couldn't do from far away. What great words that Paul says about Epaphroditus. And wouldn't it be neat if we got to the end of our life and there was someone who would speak about us in that way? Someone who he would say, oh, you know what? Whenever James, came into the room, we were all glad to see him, or something like that. So we could just get through this passage, Epaphroditus' character, how much Paul enjoyed his company, how much Paul loved him, and how much the Philippians really longed to see him, how much they loved Epaphroditus as well. So Epaphroditus is a good guy all the way around. He'd probably be one of those people where you maybe want to have him as your boss or something, or if you want him to be one of your relatives. He'd be that kind of person that, would be a chill person in the room, perhaps. The person that gets along with everybody. What a great witness to the Christian faith. And what a great person Epaphroditus must have been, because even when he was sick, there are people like Paul and the Philippians who are really worried about him. So we probably need more Epaphroditus in this world, and maybe you and I could be more like Epaphroditus in our lives. Well, that is the end of chapter 2. So we made it through chapter 2 today. Next time we meet, we're going to be taking a look at Philippians chapter 3. We're going to be off for a couple of weeks. And then later on, in a couple of weeks, we'll get back again. So I'll post on our Facebook page when our next event will be, when we have this. But again, we're going to take a break for a couple of weeks. I'm going to be taking some vacation. I'm going to be out of town during this time, and so I'll put on our Facebook page in the event section when our next Bible study will be. But we'll jump into Philippians chapter 3 next time when we meet again, and we'll see you on Sunday at 10 a.m. for our third vacation Bible school, all church vacation Bible school session. We'll have that this Sunday at 10 a.m. in person at Horizon High School, and then also live streaming here at our Facebook page. Well, thank you so much for being here. Good to see you all. God's blessings to you, and may God's peace be with you. And let's go out and let's be Epaphroditus in this world. We'll see you next time.